The Lavender Cottage by the River Avon. A tale of Ewu-San-Ar, England. The River Avon curved like a silver ribbon through the Warwickshire fields, and where it bent gentlest, just beyond the village of Welford, stood a cottage the color of old honey, its walls half-timbered, its thatch green with moss. Lavender grew wild along the path to its door, rows upon rows of it, planted by hands long since gone still, filling the air each summer with a scent so thick that travelers on the river road often slowed their carts simply to breathe it in. This was Lavender Cottage, and it belonged, as it had for 3 generations, to the women of the Fairweather family. Eleanor Fairweather knelt now among the purple stalks, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her basket half full of cuttings. She was 19, with hair the brown of river silt and eyes that missed little. Her grandmother, Agnes, said she had her mother's hands quick, careful, made for healing work though. Eleanor herself sometimes wondered if such hands might have been better suited for something less watched, less whispered about, in a village that still crossed itself when the old women walked by. "You'll bruise the stems if you pull so hard," Agnes called from the cottage door. She was 70 years old, and bent like a willow in wind. But her voice carried across the garden with the authority of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived 3 harvests of famine. "Gentle child, everything gentle. The plant remembers how it was handled, same as a person does." Eleanor smiled without looking up. She had heard this 1,000 times, and still it settled something in her chest each time, the way her grandmother's voice always did, steady as the river itself. It was the spring of 1532, and England was a kingdom holding its breath. Word traveled even to villages small as Welford. The king had set his eye on a new queen, the old Queen Catherine cast off like a worn glove, and the Pope in Rome, muttering threats that meant little to a lavender farmer, but everything, it was said, to the great lords and the black-robed men of the church. Eleanor did not much trouble herself with kings. Her world was smaller and, she thought, better for it. Bounded by the river on one side and the beechwood on the other, filled with the small, real work of growing things and mending people. But even small worlds have their storms coming, whether they know it or not. "There's a rider on the road," Agnes said suddenly, shading her eyes with one spotted hand. "Coming fast, too fast for good news." Eleanor rose, brushing soil from her skirts, and followed her grandmother's gaze to where a horse and its rider crested the low hill above the water meadow. She could not yet see the face, only the dark shape of a man bent low over the horse's neck, cloak snapping behind him like a crow's wing. "Perhaps he's only late for his supper," Eleanor offered. Though she did not quite believe it, Agnes said nothing. She simply watched, the way she watched storm clouds gather over the Malvern Hills, not with fear, but with the patient attention of someone who had learned, long ago, that trouble rarely announced itself politely. The rider did not stop at the cottage. He thundered past on the river road, mud flying from the horse's hooves, and was gone toward the village before Eleanor could even lift her hand in greeting. But something in his passing left the afternoon feeling different, thinner, somehow, like the sound after a bell has stopped ringing, but before silence has fully returned. "Come," Agnes said at last, turning back toward the cottage. "The lavender will keep. I find I've lost my taste for the garden today." Eleanor followed her grandmother inside, past the drying herbs that hung in fragrant bundles from the rafters. Chamomile and yarrow, tansy and rue, the whole quiet pharmacy that had kept half the village in health for as long as anyone could remember. She did not know that afternoon that she was looking at the last easy days she and her grandmother would know for a long while. She only knew that the lavender smelled sweeter than usual, and that sweetness, her grandmother always said, sometimes came just before the frost. Welford-on-Avon was not a large village, a church with a squat Norman tower, a mill, a scattering of cottages along the river, and at its center, the green, where the market was held each Thursday. Eleanor walked there the following morning with a basket of dried lavender and rosewater to sell, as she did most weeks, and found the air humming with talk in a way that made her step slow. "Did you hear?" said Goodwife Turner, not troubling to lower her voice as Eleanor approached her stall, "that it was Sir Walter's own steward who rode through yesterday, sent ahead to make the manor ready?" "Ready for what?" asked her neighbor, a weaver's wife with flour still dusting her apron. "For Sir Walter himself, of course. Come back from London, and not alone, they say, bringing some fine business with him, something to do with the priory lands up past Bidford." Eleanor set her basket down and busied herself arranging the little bundles of lavender, though her ears stayed fixed on the conversation. Sir Walter Blackwood held the manor that bordered the Fairweather land, a wide holding of pasture and woodland that had come to him through his father and, before that, through methods the older villagers only discussed in murmurs. He was a man Eleanor had met perhaps a dozen times in her life, always at a distance, always with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being deferred to. "He'll be wanting a wife soon, mark me," Goodwife Turner went on. "A man of his standing, no lady yet at his table. My sister's girl serves in the kitchen there, says he's asked after every eligible young woman within a day's ride, though none seem to suit him." "Perhaps he's particular," the weaver's wife laughed. "Perhaps he's cursed," Goodwife Turner said, and though she said it lightly, she made a small sign with her fingers all the same. The old ward against ill fortune that Eleanor had seen the village women make my whole life, usually just before or just after they bought something from Agnes's basket. It was a strange thing, Eleanor thought, not for the first time, to be both needed and feared in the same breath. The village came to Lavender Cottage when a child ran fever, when a birth went wrong, when a wound would not close, and yet those same neighbors would not meet Agnes's eyes on the church steps, would cross to the far side of the lane if she walked too near after dusk. Wise women had always lived this way, Agnes said. Useful in daylight, suspect after dark. Eleanor Fairweather. She turned to find Father Cuthbert approaching, his black robe dusty at the hem, his broad, kind face creased with the particular worry he wore whenever matters of Rome and London reached even as far as Welford. "Father," she dipped a small curtsy. "How does your grandmother keep—" "Well enough, thank you, though she took a strange turn yesterday, watching a rider pass on the road." Father Cuthbert's mouth tightened. "There is much passing on the roads these days that gives a wise person pause. Tell her," He stopped himself, glanced once around the market square, and lowered his voice. "Tell her to have a care, Eleanor. There are men come from London with new ideas about the church, about property, about what belongs to whom. And in uncertain times, men look for someone to blame when their certainties crumble. Your grandmother has always stood a little apart from the common way of things. That has served her well in peaceful years. I am not so certain it will serve her in the years ahead." He did not wait for her answer, only nodded and moved on toward the church, leaving Eleanor standing amid the noise of the market, with a coldness settling in her stomach that no spring sunshine could quite warm away. She sold her lavender that morning, almost without noticing the coins passing through her hands, her mind turning instead over Father Cuthbert's words, and Goodwife Turner's careless little ward sign, and the dark shape of the rider vanishing toward the manor house. The day before, something was changing in Welford. She could feel it, the way she felt weather coming in the skin, before the sky itself gave any sign. The storm broke 3 nights later, rolling down from the hills with a violence that rattled the cottage shutters and sent the hens shrieking into their coop. Eleanor sat by the fire, mending a torn hem, while Agnes ground dried comfrey root at the table. The mortar's steady rhythm, a kind of music, against the thunder outside. It was the dog that heard it first. Old Bran, lying by the hearth, lifted his head and gave a low, uncertain growl toward the door. "Someone's on the path," Agnes said, setting down her pestle. "In this?" Eleanor rose, drawing her shawl close. Through the small window, she could see nothing but sheets of silver rain and the black shapes of the lavender rose bent flat beneath the wind. And then, a shape that was not lavender. A man's shape, staggering, one hand pressed to his side, moving toward the cottage, as though the light in the window were the only fixed point left in a world gone entirely to water. "Grandmother! I see him!" Agnes was already moving toward the door, her age falling away from her, the way it always did when there was healing work to be done. "Open the door, Eleanor, and mind the wind doesn't tear it from its hinges." The man collapsed nearly onto the threshold, and between them, Eleanor and Agnes hauled him inside, water sheeting from his cloak onto the swept dirt floor. He was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to a pale forehead and a gash along his ribs that had soaked through his doublet with blood gone thin and pink in the rain. "Fell," he managed, teeth chattering. "The bridge at Bidford. The old planks gave way beneath my horse." "I do not know." He stopped, his eyes rolling back, and Agnes caught his head before it struck the floor. "On the table, quickly," she said, and Eleanor did not hesitate, sweeping aside the mortar and the drying herbs to clear space. Between them they laid him out, and Agnes's hands, which had trembled faintly over her needlework that very evening, moved now with perfect steadiness as she cut away the ruined doublet and examined the wound beneath. "A rib, cracked, but not broken through," she murmured, half to herself, half to Eleanor. "The bleeding is from a graze along the skin, not deep. He'll live if the fever doesn't take him." Eleanor the yarrow, and clean linen, and set water to boil. Eleanor worked without thinking, her hands finding the herbs and cloths by long habit, while her eyes kept returning to the stranger's face, even pale and slack with pain. It was a face of some fineness, dark brows, a mouth that seemed made for wry amusement even now in its unconsciousness. His hands, she noticed as she helped bind his ribs, were not a farmer's hands, nor a soldier's, but softer, ink-stained at the fingertips. "A scholar," Agnes said, following her granddaughter's gaze. "Or a clerk. Look at the stain there. That's not blood. That's gall ink, worked deep into the skin over years. Whoever he is, he spends more hours with a pen than a sword. What is he doing on the Bidford Road, in a storm, at such an hour?" "That," Agnes said, tying off the linen with a firm knot, "is a question I imagine he will not be eager to answer once he wakes and remembers himself. Men do not ride hard through storms unless something drives them, Eleanor, and it is rarely good weather that drives a man to such recklessness." The stranger stirred then, his eyes fluttering half open, dark and unfocused in the firelight. "Where?" he began. "Hush," Agnes said, not unkindly. "You are safe. You are at Lavender Cottage, by the river. Sleep now, and we will have your answers in the morning." He seemed to want to argue, but exhaustion and pain pulled him under before he could form the words, and he sank back into stillness, his breathing evening out beneath Agnes's careful hands. Eleanor stood watching him a moment longer than was perhaps necessary, and told herself it was only the healer's curiosity that kept her eyes upon his face. Outside, the storm raged on, unconcerned with the small drama unfolding within the honey-colored walls of the cottage. But by morning, Eleanor would understand that the storm had brought far more to her doorstep than a wounded traveler. It had brought a secret, and secrets, in Welford, in that uneasy spring of 1532, were more dangerous than any storm. He woke at dawn when the gray light through the cottage window was still soft enough not to hurt his eyes, and found himself looking up at rafters hung thick with drying herbs, and beyond them a young woman's face bent close, studying him with the particular frankness of someone accustomed to examining wounds rather than faces. "You're awake," Eleanor said, setting down the cloth she'd been using to cool his brow. "That's a good sign. How does your side feel?" "As though a horse fell on it," he said, and then winced, both at the pain of speaking and at the memory, which, in a manner of speaking, it very nearly did. "My grandmother says a cracked rib and a fever that broke some time before dawn. Thank the saints. You've slept the better part of a day and a night." She poured something from a clay cup, a bitter-smelling tisane of willow bark and feverfew, and helped him raise his head enough to drink it. "You gave us quite a fright, arriving as you did. I gave myself a fright too, I confess." He managed a thin smile, studying her in turn, now that his senses had returned to him properly. She had a steadiness about her that put him oddly at ease, even lying wounded in a stranger's cottage. "I am in your debt, and I do not even know to whom I owe it. Eleanor Fairweather. This is my grandmother's cottage, Agnes Fairweather, who set your ribs and closed your wound, though she's gone to the village this morning for supplies. Thomas Gray," he said, "of Oxford most recently, before that of London, and before that of a small manor in Kent that I have not seen in some years. And what, Master Gray of Oxford and London and Kent, were you doing on the Bidford Road in a storm fit to drown a fish? He hesitated, and Eleanor watched the hesitation with interest, not offense, but the frank curiosity of someone who had already guessed there was more to the story than mere misfortune. I was sent, he said finally, by a certain gentleman scholar in Oxford, to the priory near Bordesley, to examine and catalogue certain manuscripts, before he stopped himself. Before matters change, as they are like to, given the temper of things in London just now. He looked at her carefully, as if weighing how much a lavender farmer's granddaughter might understand of such things, and something in her steady gaze seemed to decide him. The king's business with Rome grows more urgent by the month, Mistress Fairweather. There is talk, quiet talk, but growing louder, that the smaller religious houses may not stand much longer under royal favor. Men of learning fear what will become of the manuscripts they hold. Should the houses be dissolved and their libraries scattered, or, God forbid, burned or sold, for the value of their bindings alone, I am sent to make records, copies, before it is too late. It is quiet work. It was not meant to draw attention. And yet you rode through a storm at night, as though the devil himself pursued you. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not the devil. But there are men in this county, men of standing, men with an eye toward priory lands they hope to acquire cheaply once the houses fall, who take a dim view of scholars poking through old records, records that might show certain boundaries, certain rights of the poor upon the land, that would prove inconvenient to a man hoping to enclose common fields for his own grazing. Eleanor thought at once of Sir Walter Blackwood, of the market gossip about priory lands past Bidford, and felt a small, cold understanding settle into place. "You were followed," she said. "I believe I was, a rider on the Bidford Road, just before the bridge gave way, though whether the bridge failed by chance or by design, I could not say." He met her eyes. "I do not wish to bring danger to your door, Mistress Fairweather. If it would ease your grandmother's mind, I will move on as soon as I am able." Eleanor considered him a long moment. This dark-eyed, ink-stained stranger who had tumbled so suddenly into her quiet life, carrying with him the first real shape of the trouble she had felt gathering for weeks. "You'll do no such thing," she said at last. "Not with a cracked rib and a fever only just broken. You'll stay until you're properly healed, Master Gray, and we'll worry about danger when danger actually arrives at the door." She did not yet know how soon that would be. Over the following days, as Thomas's strength returned, he told them more carefully, in pieces, the way a man tells a story he has not yet decided how much of to share. He had studied at Oxford under a master who corresponded with scholars across Europe, men who wrote anxious letters about the fate of monastic libraries in lands where reform had already swept through. Books burned, manuscripts scattered to line trunks or wrapped fish at market. Centuries of careful copying undone in an afternoon's zeal or greed. "It is not only faith that concerns my master," Thomas explained one evening, sitting now in the cottage's single good chair by the fire, strong enough to sit upright, though still tender at the ribs. "It is memory itself. Every manuscript in that priory library is a record of land grants, of boundaries, of rights the common people hold to gather wood or graze cattle on what has always been shared ground. If those records vanish along with the priory and new lords redraw the boundaries as it suits them, who is left to say what was promised? Generations passed to villages like this one. Agnes, shelling peas by the window, looked up sharply. And you believe Sir Walter Blackwood has an interest in seeing such records vanish? I know only what I overheard, Mistress Fairweather, in an inn at Alcester, before I ever reached Bidford. Two men, drinking freely, spoke of a gentleman of this county, eager to see the priory's holdings pass into private hands, and impatient with any scholar poking about the archive first. They did not name him, but the direction of their talk and the direction I was riding made me uneasy enough to travel faster than was wise. He glanced at Eleanor, a decision I paid for at the Bidford Bridge. Bidford Bridge has stood sound for 30 years, Agnes said slowly. I crossed it myself, not 2 months past. Then perhaps, Thomas said quietly, it did not fail entirely by chance. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Eleanor found her hands had gone still over her mending, her mind turning the pieces over. The rider who had passed the cottage days before Thomas's arrival, Goodwife Turner's talk of Sir Walter's steward making the manor ready, Father Cuthbert's careful warning about men from London with new ideas about property. You must be careful whom you tell of this, Agnes said finally. In Welford, walls have thin ears, and Sir Walter's favor or displeasure touches more households than you might guess, through rents, through the mill, through 100 small threads that bind a village to its manor. If he believes you a danger to his interests, Master Grey, he will not need proof of wrongdoing to make trouble for you. Suspicion alone is often weapon enough in these times. Then I am doubly in your debt, Thomas said, for sheltering a man who may bring exactly such trouble to your door. We have weathered suspicion before, Agnes said, with a dryness that made Eleanor glance at her, and shall likely weather it again, whether you had arrived or not. Better, perhaps, that when trouble comes, it comes with a reason we understand, rather than out of the empty air, as it so often has before. Eleanor said nothing, but she found herself watching Thomas Grey with new eyes that evening. Not merely the wounded stranger who had stumbled from the storm, but a man caught, whether he wished it or not, in the same slow-gathering danger she had sensed circling the cottage for weeks. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar and faintly unwelcome stirring beneath the fear, a curiosity, almost a kinship, toward this quiet scholar who spoke of old records and vanished boundaries as though they mattered as much as any living soul. Perhaps, she thought, they did. By the second week, Thomas was strong enough to walk, and it became his habit, with Agnes's blessing, given more readily than Eleanor expected, to accompany Eleanor on her morning gathering along the riverbank, where watercress grew thick in the shallows, and certain mosses Agnes prized clung to the shaded stones beneath the old willows. You handle every leaf as though it might break, Thomas observed one such morning, watching her strip cress into her basket with quick, careful fingers. Because it might, Eleanor said. Bruise a leaf, and its virtue bleeds out before you ever get it home. My grandmother taught me that before she taught me my letters. You read then? Well enough. My mother insisted. Before she died, she said a healer who could read might learn from books what her own hands hadn't yet taught her. Grandmother thought it a foolish extravagance for a farmer's granddaughter, but she never stopped me borrowing what she had. Thomas was quiet a moment, watching the river slide past, brown and swollen still from the recent rains. There is little enough in this world that surprises me anymore, Mistress Fairweather, but I confess you do. A healer's hands and a reader's mind, out here at the edge of everything. The edge of everything, Eleanor repeated, half amused. Is that how Oxford sees Warwickshire? Oxford sees little beyond its own walls, in truth, which is perhaps its great failing. He crouched to examine a stand of watercress she'd passed over. This one, is it not fit for gathering? Too close to where the sheep water. Grandmother says, fouled ground makes fouled cress, whatever the leaf looks like on the surface. She glanced at him. You're quick to learn. For a scholar of dead languages, living things interest me more than I once believed, he said, and something in the way he said it made Eleanor's cheeks warm, though she could not have said precisely why. They walked on, in a silence that did not feel empty, past the mill wheel, turning slow and constant, past the spot where the lavender rose gave way to wild meadow, until they reached the bend where the river widened into a shallow pool, clear enough to see the trout hanging motionless against the current. My mother used to bring me here, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the offering. Before she died, she'd say the river remembered everyone who'd ever loved it, and that if you sat quiet long enough, it would tell you its secrets. And did it ever tell you any? Only that patience is rewarded eventually, which is, I suppose, a secret worth having. She looked at him directly then. What will you do, Master Gray, once your ribs mend and you're fit to travel? Return to the priory and finish your work, danger or no? Thomas considered the water a long moment before answering. I ought to say yes, without hesitation, that the work matters more than any personal danger, that scholarship must not bow to threat, and I do believe that truly. But I find, since arriving at your grandmother's cottage, that I am considerably less eager to leave than I expected to be. Eleanor's heart gave an unfamiliar, unruly leap, and she busied herself with her basket to hide it. The cottage has that effect on people. Grandmother's cooking mostly. Mostly, Thomas agreed, with a small smile that told her he had not been entirely fooled by her deflection, and did not intend to press the matter further. Not yet. They gathered the last of the cress in a companionable quiet, and if their hands brushed once, twice, over the same stand of watercress, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as strict propriety might have demanded, it was a small thing, hardly worth remarking upon. Small things, though, have a way of growing. Given river water and sunlight and time enough, as Eleanor, tending her grandmother's garden, understood better than most. The summons came on a fair morning in June, carried by a liveried servant, who arrived at the cottage gate with an air of faint distaste for the mud on the path and the smell of the pigsty beyond the garden wall. Sir Walter Blackwood requests the presence of Mistress Eleanor Fairweather at the Manor House this afternoon, at his convenience, the servant announced, as though reading from a much grander document than the single folded paper in his hand. Agnes's hands stilled over her work.
For what purpose?
Sir Walter did not confide his purposes to me, mistress, only that the young woman is to come, and come promptly. After the servant had gone, Agnes turned to Eleanor with an expression her granddaughter had rarely seen. Not quite fear, but a wariness pulled taut as a bowstring. "You'll not go alone. He summoned me, grandmother, not the both of us, and I'll not have you walk into that man's house without at least the pretense of protection." Agnes's jaw was set in the way that meant argument was pointless. "Master Gray will accompany you as far as the gate, and wait there until you return." Thomas, who had been mending a fishing net by the hearth with more diligence than skill, looked up at this with an alertness that suggested he'd been half expecting to be included in whatever came next. "Gladly," he said, "though I confess I'd rather accompany her the whole way and hear whatever business a man like Sir Walter has with a lavender farmer's granddaughter. He'll not permit it, and pressing the matter will only sharpen his interest in you both." Agnes said, "Go only as far as the gate, Master Gray, and be seen doing nothing more than waiting, like any patient suitor." If either Thomas or Eleanor caught the particular weight Agnes placed on the word suitor, neither remarked upon it, though Eleanor felt her ears burn all the walk to the manor. Sir Walter received her in a long, dim hall, hung with tapestries too fine, Eleanor thought, for a county squire of only modest ancient lineage, the sort of finery that spoke of new money rather than old blood, however much the family crest above the hearth tried to suggest otherwise. He was a broad man of perhaps 45, handsome in a heavy, well-fed way, with pale eyes that studied Eleanor with an assessing coolness that made her spine straighten instinctively. "Mistress Fairweather, I am told your grandmother's herbs have kept half this parish in health these 20 years. We do what good we can, sir." "Admirable." He gestured her to a seat she did not take, choosing instead to remain standing, which seemed to amuse rather than offend him. "I will speak plainly, as I find plain speech saves everyone considerable time. I have need of a wife, Mistress Fairweather, and I find myself, on consideration, drawn to a woman of practical skill rather than mere ornamental breeding. You are young, healthy, capable, qualities I value considerably more than a great dowry, of which, I understand, you have none." Eleanor's breath caught, though she kept her face carefully still. "Sir, I hardly know what to—" "You need say nothing today. I am not a man who expects a decision made in the space of a single conversation, but I would have you understand the advantages such a match would offer. Advantages that extend, I might add, to your grandmother. A cottage on the manor's borders is a precarious thing to hold, Mistress Fairweather, particularly for a woman of her particular reputation. Should that cottage fall under my protection, through our union, certain difficulties might be smoothed considerably. Should it not—" He let the sentence trail, unfinished, and smiled in a way that made the threat plainer than any completed words could have. "I understand you perfectly, sir," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I thought you might." His pale eyes flicked, briefly, toward the window, and Eleanor followed his gaze to see, in the far distance, the small shape of Thomas waiting at the manor gate, exactly as instructed. Something in Sir Walter's expression sharpened. "I understand also that your grandmother has taken in a stranger these past weeks. A scholar, I am told, with business at the priory near Bordsley." Eleanor said nothing, but her silence itself felt like an answer, and she watched Sir Walter note it. "Consider my offer, Mistress Fairweather," he said, turning from the window at last, "and consider carefully who you allow beneath your grandmother's roof in these uncertain times. Some guests bring more danger than shelter is worth." She left the manor with her heart pounding and her mind racing, understanding now with a cold clarity that Sir Walter Blackwood's interest in her was never truly about her hands or her health or her practical skill. It was about the cottage, and about controlling whatever secrets hers, her grandmother's, or Thomas Gray's might threaten, whatever plans he was building toward the priory lands beyond. The trouble Agnes had long anticipated arrived not through Sir Walter's front door, but through the back lanes of the village, carried on the frightened voice of a mother. It was young Bess Tanner, the miller's youngest, not yet 6 years old, who fell ill first, a fever that would not break, a rash spreading across her small chest, a cough that rattled wet and frightening in the night. Her mother, half mad with fear, had first come to Agnes for a remedy, and Agnes had gone herself, spending 2 days and nights at the child's bedside, with fever-reducing tisanes and cooling cloths, doing everything her long years of skill could offer. But children in 1532 died easily and often of causes no healer, however skilled, could always turn aside. And on the third night, despite everything, Bess Tanner's fever spiked beyond anything willow bark or feverfew could touch, and by morning the child lay pale and dangerously still, breathing in shallow, frightening gasps. She did not die. By some mercy, luck, prayer, or the slow turn of her own small body's strength, the fever broke at dawn, and Bess began, slowly, to mend. But the fear she had caused in the village did not mend nearly so easily. And fear, Eleanor would learn in the days that followed, has a way of curdling into something far more dangerous than itself. It was the old witch's medicine that near killed her, Eleanor heard, walking through the market 3 days later, and stopped cold, her basket suddenly heavy in her hand. The voice belonged to Goody Price, a woman Eleanor had known her whole life, who had come to Agnes herself, not 2 winters past, for a salve for her husband's burned hand. "My cousin says the girl took worse, not better, after Agnes Fairweather's tisane, said her skin near turned blue before the fever broke." "That's not what happened," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, stepping forward. "My grandmother sat at that child's bedside 2 nights running. She saved her life." Goody Price's eyes went cold and wary, the way village eyes always did when confronted directly, and she said nothing more, only turned away with a small, deliberate gesture, that same old ward sign against ill fortune Eleanor had seen 100 times before, but never, until now, aimed so plainly at her. That evening, Father Cuthbert came to the cottage himself, his kind face drawn with worry he did little to disguise. "There is talk in the village," he said, without preamble, Once Agnes had settled him by the fire. Ugly talk. Someone I do not yet know who has been telling anyone who'll listen that the Tanner child's fever worsened, not improved, under your care. That your remedies did more harm than the fever itself. That is a lie, Agnes said flatly. I have the physician's own words from when he examined her yesterday, that the fever broke naturally, and my tisanes eased her passage through it. I believe you, Agnes. I have believed in your skill for 30 years, and I'll not stop now. Father Cuthbert leaned forward, his voice dropping. But belief is not currently the coin of the realm in this county, and I fear someone with influence enough to spread such talk quickly and widely is doing precisely that. For reasons that have little to do with the Tanner child's health, Eleanor felt the cold certainty settle over her that she had felt once before, standing in Sir Walter's dim hall. Sir Walter, she said quietly. Father Cuthbert did not confirm it outright, but neither did he deny it. I would only counsel you both, in the days ahead, to give no further cause for suspicion. No unusual gatherings, no herbs sold that might be misconstrued. No, his eyes flicked, briefly, toward the corner where Thomas sat, silent and listening, still aghast beneath Agnes's roof, though his ribs had long since mended. No guests whose presence might be twisted into further accusation. After he left, the cottage sat in heavy silence. The fires crackled the only sound, until Thomas finally spoke. This is my doing, he said quietly. My presence here has drawn exactly the attention your grandmother feared. It is Sir Walter's doing, Eleanor said fiercely, and no one else's. Do not take on guilt that belongs entirely to him. But even as she said it, she felt the ground shifting beneath the cottage's foundations. The same slow, gathering danger she had sensed weeks before. No longer distant thunder, but a storm, now breaking directly overhead. The constable came for Agnes on a gray morning 8 days later, with 2 men from the manor at his back, and a warrant bearing Sir Walter's own seal as Justice of the Peace for the district. Agnes Fairweather, you are to come before the magistrate to answer charges of witchcraft and the practice of harmful sorcery upon the person of Bess Tanner, child of this parish, the constable recited, his discomfort plain in every line of his face. He was a village man himself, and had likely bought remedies from this very cottage more than once in his life. Charges brought by whom? Agnes asked, with a calm that Eleanor, standing frozen by the hearth, found almost unbearable to witness. By Sir Walter Blackwood himself, as Justice of this district, acting upon reports received from concerned parishioners. Concerned parishioners, Agnes repeated softly, or a concerned landlord with an interest in seeing this cottage's protection removed. The constable's eyes flickered. He understood the accusation. Eleanor thought, perhaps even agreed with it. But a warrant was a warrant, and he had no power to refuse it, whatever his private doubts. You must come with us, mistress. I am sorry for it. Eleanor moved forward, her heart hammering. I'll come with her. The warrant names only Agnes Fairweather. Then I will follow and stand outside whatever door you take her through until she is released. The constable did not argue further, perhaps recognizing in Eleanor's face the same immovable stubbornness that had, for 3 generations, kept the Fairweather women rooted to this stretch of riverbank, against every wind that blew. They took Agnes not to the manor house, but to the small stone goal behind the church, a building rarely used for more than a night's confinement for drunken market day brawlers. And Eleanor stood in the lane outside it long after the door had closed, until Thomas found her there, his face white with a fury she had not yet seen in him. "This is monstrous," he said. "A child recovers from a fever, and for that an old woman is dragged to gaol on the word of a man who stands to profit from her ruin." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Thomas was quiet a long moment, his jaw working, and when he spoke again, something had hardened in him, the scholar's caution giving way to something more decisive. "I go to Bordsley," he said. "The prior there has known your grandmother for years. I have heard him speak of her skill with nothing but respect. He carries weight in this county that even Sir Walter must, at times, acknowledge. And I bring with me every scrap of the priory's old records. I have already catalogued. Records that may show precisely what claims Sir Walter has been quietly building toward these past months, and why a witchcraft charge against your grandmother might serve his purposes rather better than mere coincidence would suggest. You believe there's a connection?" "I believe," Thomas said grimly, "that men like Sir Walter Blackwood do not spend their influence carelessly. He wants something from this, your cottage's land, your silence, or perhaps something buried in those very records I was sent to protect. I mean to find out which, Eleanor, and I mean to have your grandmother free before the assizes can do her any lasting harm." He left within the hour, riding hard toward Bordsley, despite the gray sky threatening more rain, and Eleanor was left alone at the cottage gate, watching him go, understanding with sudden, vivid clarity how completely her quiet life had been swept up into currents far larger and more dangerous than lavender and river water. She could only pray, as she turned back toward the small stone gull where her grandmother sat, waiting for a justice that might not come, that Thomas Gray would return in time to matter. Thomas returned 2 days later, mud-spattered and hollow-eyed from hard riding and harder reading, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with parchment and a look on his face that was equal parts triumph and fury. "I have it," he said, finding Eleanor in the garden, where she had gone in a desperate attempt to occupy her hands while her mind circled endlessly around her grandmother's fate, or enough of it, at least, to shake Sir Walter Blackwood's confidence considerably. He spread the parchments across the kitchen table. Old grants, boundary records, a faded map showing the priory lands and the common grazing rights that had been attached to them for generations. "Here," he said, tapping one yellowed document. "A grant, sealed under the 3rd Henry, 2 centuries past, establishing common grazing and gathering rights for the villages of Welford and Bidford. Upon these fields, the very fields bordering your grandmother's cottage, and the very fields Sir Walter has been quietly attempting to enclose for his own grazing these 18 months, according to the prior's own account."
What does that have to do with a witchcraft charge?
Everything, I believe. Your grandmother's cottage sits directly athwart the old boundary line described in this grant, a line that, should the priory's records be destroyed or discredited, would leave no clear proof of the common rights at all, and no obstacle to Sir Walter simply absorbing the land into his own holdings. Cottage and all, once its current occupants are removed from it. A witchcraft conviction, Eleanor, ends not merely in a fine or a public shaming. It ends, often, in forfeiture of property to the accuser or the crown. Your grandmother's cottage and everything attached to it would fall very conveniently into Sir Walter's hands should this charge succeed. Eleanor sat down heavily, the pieces resolving into a shape uglier than she had allowed herself to imagine. He engineered this. The child's illness, the rumors. I cannot yet prove the illness itself was anything but chance, though I have my suspicions there too, given the timing. But the rumors and the speed with which they hardened into formal charge that has the shape of careful design, not spontaneous village fear. Can this be enough to free her? Not alone, Thomas admitted. A magistrate concerned chiefly with witchcraft will care little for boundary disputes 2 centuries old unless we can show direct evidence connecting Sir Walter's land ambitions to the charge itself. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion plain beneath the determination. But the prior has agreed to write on your grandmother's behalf, testifying to her long good character and skill. And I have found something else, Eleanor. Something that may matter more. He drew a final document from the satchel, more recent than the others. Its ink barely faded. A record of payment, he said quietly, from Sir Walter Blackwood's own steward to a physician in Ulster, dated 1 week before Bess Tanner's illness began. I do not yet know what the payment purchased, but I intend to find out before the assizes convene. Eleanor stared at the document, at the careful, damning ink, and felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest since the constable's arrival began cautiously to loosen. Thomas, she said, if this proves what I think it might, then Sir Walter Blackwood will find himself considerably more concerned with his own defense than with your grandmother's prosecution. Thomas finished grimly. But we have little time. The assizes convene in 4 days. I ride for Ulster at first light. The physician at Ulster was an old man named Master Colby, whose hands shook faintly with age, but whose eyes remained sharp, and who received Thomas's visit with the wary stillness of a man who had long expected such a reckoning might one day arrive at his door. I did nothing that harmed the child directly, he said, once Thomas had laid the payment record on his table without preamble. You must understand that I was paid only to provide a substance that would produce a fever, a rash, symptoms alarming to look upon, but not in the doses I supplied, truly dangerous to a healthy child. I was assured it was meant only to cause a fright, a family scare that might be laid at another's door. Nothing more. Laid at whose door, Master Colby? The old physician's hands trembled harder now. I did not ask, and I was not told directly. But the steward who came to me spoke of the Fairweather cottage, of an old woman whose reputation might prove useful to unsettle, should certain village folk grow suspicious enough of her remedies. I thought it a cruel scheme, sir, and told him so, but he offered gold enough to quiet my conscience. God forgive me, and I am an old man with debts of my own. You will swear this before the magistrate? Master Colby's face had gone the gray of old ash. If I do not, sir, I face the noose myself. Do I not? for poisoning a child, however mild the dose was meant to be. And if you do, Thomas said, with a gentleness he had not expected to find in himself, for this frightened, complicit old man, you may yet save an innocent woman's life, and perhaps your own soul besides. Sir Walter Blackwood used you as he intended to use my host's grandmother as an instrument for his own gain, careless of what became of either of you once you'd served his purpose. I do not think he would hesitate a moment to let you hang, should it protect his own name." The physician was silent a long while, staring at the payment record, at his own damning signature upon the receipt Thomas had also uncovered, buried among the steward's careless accounts. "I will come," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help me, I will come and tell the truth of it." Thomas rode back toward Welford that same night, exhausted past reckoning, but carrying with him, at last, something more than circumstantial suspicion. A confession, a witness, and 4 days remaining before the assizes would decide Agnes Fairweather's fate. He did not know, riding hard through the darkness, that Sir Walter Blackwood had already learned of his journey to Ulster, and was, at that very hour, making arrangements of his own to ensure that Master Colby's confession never reached the magistrate's ears at all. The court convened in the great hall of the shire town, a space grander and colder than anything Eleanor had stood within before, its high windows admitting a thin gray light that seemed to drain the color from every face beneath it. Agnes stood before the magistrate in the same plain gown she had worn to Jall, her back straight despite 11 days of confinement, her eyes fixed steadily forward. Sir Walter sat among the gathered gentry with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of defeat. And when the magistrate called for any witnesses in the accused defense, he wore the faint, satisfied smile of a man watching a play whose ending he had already written. That smile did not survive the hour. Father Cuthbert spoke first, testifying to 30 years of Agnes's healing skill and Christian charity toward the poor of the parish. Then the prior of Bordesley, summoned at Thomas's urgent request, spoke of ancient grants and boundary rights, and of Sir Walter's persistent, increasingly urgent inquiries these past months regarding the enclosure of common lands bordering the Fairweather cottage. Sir Walter's smile had thinned to a hard line by the time Thomas himself was called, presenting the payment record uncovered among the steward's accounts. But it was Master Colby, brought forward at the last moment, his old hands shaking visibly as he was sworn, who broke the courtroom into a murmur that took the magistrate's gavel 3 strikes to quiet. "I was paid," the physician said, his voice cracking but carrying nonetheless to every corner of the hall, "by Sir Walter Blackwood's own steward, to provide a substance intended to sicken the tanner child, that suspicion might fall upon Agnes Fairweather's remedies, and her reputation be ruined enough that her cottage, and the land attached to it, might be more easily acquired once she was removed from it." The hall erupted. Sir Walter rose, his composure finally cracking into open fury. "This is a fabrication, a conspiracy of scholars and old women against an honest man's good name." "Sit down, Sir Walter," the magistrate said, with a coldness that had not been present in his voice before, "or I shall have you removed, and this court will proceed to consider charges against you rather than the woman you accused. It took the remainder of that long, cold afternoon for the full truth to unwind before the court. The steward's confession, extracted under the magistrate's own sharp questioning, that Sir Walter had indeed orchestrated the entire scheme, hoping a witchcraft charge would see the Fairweather cottage forfeited, its inconvenient position astride the old boundary line, erased along with its owner's freedom, or, perhaps, her life. The steward, seeing his master's ruin as inevitable, offered every detail freely, in hopes of lighter treatment for himself. By evening, Agnes Fairweather stood acquitted, the charges against her dismissed, with the magistrate's own stern words condemning the abuse of law for private gain. Sir Walter Blackwood, by contrast, found himself remanded to await trial on charges of conspiracy, corruption of a justice's office, and the endangerment of a child's life, charges that would, in the months to come, strip him of both his lands and his liberty. Eleanor embraced her grandmother outside the great hall as the last gray light faded from the sky, both of them weeping in a way neither had permitted herself throughout the long ordeal, while Thomas stood a little apart, watching with an expression Eleanor did not yet have words for, though she recognized somewhere beneath her relief and exhaustion that she very much wanted to learn them. They returned to Lavender Cottage 3 days later. The journey slowed to accommodate Agnes's exhaustion, and found the lavender rose blooming full and fragrant in their absence, as though the garden itself had continued its quiet work, undisturbed by all the danger that had swirled around its owners. "It missed us," Agnes said, kneeling stiffly among the purple stalks, with an expression of profound contentment. "Or perhaps it simply doesn't concern itself with the follies of men and their courts." "There's wisdom in that, I think, that I mean to relearn." Eleanor found Thomas that evening down by the river, at the bend where the water widened into its clear, still pool, watching the trout hang motionless against the current, just as they had, months before, on that first quiet morning of gathering cress together. "You'll be returning to Oxford soon," she said, settling beside him on the bank, "now that your work at the Priory can proceed without Sir Walter's shadow over it." "I had thought so," Thomas admitted, "though I find the closer such a departure comes, the less I wish to make it." "The river again?" she asked, half teasing, remembering his earlier confession. "The river," he agreed, "and the cottage, and a certain lavender farmer's granddaughter, with a healer's hands and a reader's mind, who has occupied considerably more of my thoughts these past months than any manuscript at Bordsley." He turned to face her fully. "I have little to offer you, Eleanor, beyond a scholar's modest income and a great deal of ink-stained devotion. But I find I cannot leave this place, or you, without at least asking whether such an offer might be welcome." Eleanor felt her heart lift in a way that had nothing to do with relief or exhaustion, and everything to do with the particular warmth that had been building quietly between them since the night a storm had first delivered him, half drowned and desperate, to her grandmother's door. "My grandmother always says," she said softly, "that the river remembers everyone who's ever loved it, and tells its secrets to those patient enough to listen. I think, Master Gray, that it has been telling me this particular secret for some weeks now, and I have simply been too frightened or too stubborn to properly listen." "And now?" "Now," Eleanor said, taking his ink-stained hand in her own steady healer's one. I find myself considerably more willing to hear it. The sun set slow and golden over the river Avon that evening, gilding the water and the lavender and the honey-colored walls of the cottage beyond. And if the old willows along the bank had any opinion on the quiet promise exchanged beside their roots, they kept it, as willows do, to themselves. They were married that October in the small church whose Norman tower had watched over Welford for 4 centuries, with Father Cuthbert presiding and Agnes standing proud and straight-backed in the front pew, entirely recovered from her ordeal, and already, Eleanor suspected, plotting improvements to the garden for the following spring. Thomas had taken a position at last, not at Oxford, as he'd once expected, but closer to home, tutoring the children of a reform-minded gentleman near Stratford, and continuing, in whatever hours remained to him, his careful work of copying and preserving what records he could of the Priory's holdings, now that Bordsley's fate, like so many religious houses across England, hung increasingly uncertain beneath the king's shifting favor. Sir Walter's lands, forfeited following his conviction, passed eventually to the Crown, and thence, through the slow, uncertain workings of Tudor justice, into hands considerably more sympathetic to the old boundary rights his scheming had once threatened to erase entirely. The common grazing lands remained common, the village's ancient rights preserved, and Lavender Cottage stood exactly where it had always stood, its lavender rose blooming each summer with a fragrance that seemed, to those who remembered that difficult spring and summer, all the sweeter for having so nearly been lost. Agnes lived 11 years more, long enough to see her first great-grandchild born beneath the cottage's honey-colored roof, long enough to teach Eleanor's own daughter, in time, the same careful, gentle handling of lavender stems that had been passed down through 3 generations of Fairweather women before her. She died at last on a quiet spring morning in her own bed, with the scent of new lavender drifting through the open window, and the village that had once turned suspicious eyes upon her walked in solemn, grateful numbers behind her coffin to the churchyard, having learned, in the years since the assizes, to value rather than fear the wisdom she had always offered so freely. Eleanor and Thomas remained at the cottage all their days, raising their children among the herb rows and the river's steady murmur. Thomas's scholarship and Eleanor's healing skill, weaving together into a life neither had quite anticipated on that stormy night when a wounded stranger first stumbled through the cottage door. England, in those years, changed around them in ways vast and small. The king's break with Rome complete, the great monasteries falling one by one in the years that followed, the old certainties of Eleanor's girlhood reshaped into a kingdom she and her children would need to learn anew. But the river Avon continued its patient course regardless, and the lavender continued its faithful blooming each summer, and the cottage at the river's bend continued to stand, as it had for generations, and would for generations more, a small, steady point of warmth and healing against whatever storms the wider world might yet bring rolling down from the hills. For, as Agnes Fairweather had always said, and as Eleanor taught her own children, in turn, everything gentle, the plant remembers how it was handled, same as a person does. And so, in its quiet way, does the river and the land and every soul patient enough to listen for what they have to tell.